Marcus Wellington stepped out of his luxury sedan at Buckingham Palace, adjusting his expensive suit jacket with an air of superiority that seemed to follow him everywhere. At 42, he had built a small fortune through questionable business deals and had developed the unfortunate habit of believing his money made him better than everyone else. His wife Sarah walked beside him, already cringing at the familiar look in his eyes that meant trouble was brewing. The summer morning in London was perfect for tourists, with clear skies and a gentle breeze. Hundreds of visitors had gathered to witness the changing of the guard ceremony, one of Britain's most treasured traditions. Families with excited children, elderly couples fulfilling lifelong dreams, and young backpackers all mixed together in the crowd, united by their respect for the historic spectacle they were about to witness. Marcus, however, saw the crowd differently. To him, these were just obstacles preventing him from getting the perfect photograph for his social media accounts. He had spent considerable money on this London vacation, staying at the most expensive hotel and dining at exclusive restaurants. Also, he could brag to his friends back in New York about his sophisticated European adventure. The Royal Guard stood at their posts with the dignity and discipline that had made them famous worldwide. Their red tunics were immaculate, their black bearskin hats perfectly positioned, and their expressions stoic and professional. These men had trained for years to reach this position, understanding that they represented not just themselves but the entire British monarchy and military tradition. Among them stood James Mitchell, a 26-year-old guard who had served in Afghanistan before joining the Queen's Guard. His family had a long tradition of military service, and he took immense pride in his role. Standing perfectly still, despite the growing crowd and rising temperature, James embodied the discipline and honor that the position demanded. Marcus pushed through the crowd with little regard for others, stepping on feet and shoving past children without apology. His expensive camera hung around his neck like a badge of his perceived importance. Sarah tried to apologize to the people. Her husband had rudely displaced, but Marcus was already focused on his next target. He had spotted what he considered the perfect photo opportunity. One of the guards stood near an ornate gate, the morning light hitting his uniform just right. Marcus could already imagine the likes and comments this photo would generate on his Instagram account. He would caption it something about experiencing authentic British culture and his exclusive access to royal traditions. The rope barriers that kept tourists at a respectful distance meant nothing to Marcus. Rules, in his mind, were for ordinary people, not for someone of his stature and wealth. He had talked his way past security at exclusive clubs, cut lines at expensive restaurants, and generally operated under the assumption that money could buy him exemption from common courtesy and regulations. As he approached the guard, Marcus pulled out his phone and began taking selfies, moving closer and closer to the motionless soldier. Other tourists watched in uncomfortable silence, sensing that something inappropriate was happening but unsure how to intervene. The respect and reverence that typically surrounded the guards seemed to create a protective bubble that Marcus was carelessly about to burst. James noticed the approaching tourist but maintained his position and composure as training demanded. He had dealt with overeager visitors before, but something about this man's demeanor suggested this encounter might be different. The tourist's expensive clothes and confident stride indicated someone who was used to getting his way, regardless of rules or social expectations. Marcus began speaking loudly to his phone as he recorded, describing his amazing access to the royal guards and making jokes about their funny hats and toy soldier appearance. His voice carried across the previously respectful crowd, causing other visitors to shift uncomfortably. Children who had been excitedly watching the guards now looked confused by the man's mocking tone. The morning sun climbed higher, casting longer shadows across the palace grounds. What had started as a peaceful, dignified ceremony was slowly being transformed by one man's inability to respect boundaries or show basic human decency. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would teach Marcus a lesson about respect he would never forget. Sarah Wellington stood at the edge of the crowd, feeling a familiar sense of dread wash over her. She had witnessed her husband's entitled behavior countless times before, but never in such a sacred and tradition-rich setting. She wanted to call out to him, to stop him before he crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, but years of living with Marcus had taught her that intervention often only made his behavior worse. The other tourists began to murmur among themselves, some pulling out their own phones not to celebrate the moment, but to document what they sensed might become an incident. The energy of the crowd was shifting from celebration and wonder to tension and anticipation. Marcus remained oblivious to the changing atmosphere around him. In his mind, he was simply taking advantage of an opportunity that his money and status had earned him. He failed to notice the disapproving glances from other visitors, the way parents were pulling their children closer, or the subtle signs that he was about to cross into territory where his wealth and arrogance would offer him no protection. The royal guard stood silent and still, a living symbol of duty, honor, and tradition. Years of training had prepared him for many situations, but the test of his patience and professionalism was about to begin in earnest. The morning that had started with such promise and dignity was rapidly approaching a moment that would change everyone involved. As Marcus moved even closer to the guard, his phone held high and his voice growing louder with each passing moment, the collision between entitled arrogance and unwavering duty became inevitable. The beautiful London morning would soon be remembered, not for its perfect weather or successful ceremony, but for the lesson in respect that was about to unfold before hundreds of witnesses. Marcus Wellington crossed the rope barrier without hesitation, his expensive leather shoes clicking against the ancient stones of the palace courtyard. The barrier that had kept hundreds of respectful tourists at bay meant nothing to him. In his mind, rules were suggestions, and suggestions didn't apply to people with his bank account balance. "This is perfect," Marcus announced loudly to no one in particular, holding his phone up for another selfie. "Finally, some real access to these living statues. My followers are going to love this exclusive content." James Mitchell felt the tourists' presence immediately but remained perfectly still, his training taking over. Every muscle in his body stayed rigid, his breathing controlled and measured. He had faced enemy fire in Afghanistan, endured grueling training exercises in harsh weather, and maintained his post through rain, snow, and blazing heat. One entitled tourist, no matter how obnoxious, would not break his composure. The crowd behind the barrier began to stir uneasily. Whispered conversations started among the visitors as they watched Marcus move freely in the restricted area. A mother pulled her young daughter closer, concerned that the man's behavior might escalate the situation. An elderly British gentleman shook his head in disgust, muttering about bloody tourists under his breath. "Hey there, soldier boy," Marcus called out cheerfully, positioning himself directly in front of James. "Mind if I get a quick photo with you? Don't worry, I'll make sure to tag the location. Great publicity for you guys, right?" James stared straight ahead, his dark eyes fixed on a point far beyond Marcus's head. Protocol was clear about interactions with tourists during duty. He was to remain silent, motionless, and professional, regardless of provocation. The honor of his position, his regiment, and the crown itself rested on his ability to maintain dignity in all circumstances. Marcus interpreted the silence as permission and stepped even closer, now just inches from the guard's face. He held up his phone and began taking rapid-fire selfies, making exaggerated expressions and peace signs while talking continuously to his camera. "So here I am with one of the famous British Royal Guards," Marcus narrated loudly. "These guys are supposed to be super serious and never break character. Pretty impressive discipline, though I bet they're just regular guys underneath all that fancy dress-up costume." Sarah Wellington watched from behind the barrier, her stomach churning with embarrassment and growing fear. She knew her husband well enough to recognize the signs. Marcus was building up to something bigger, feeding off the attention and the lack of immediate consequences. When people didn't stop him quickly, he always pushed further. A palace security officer noticed the disturbance and began making his way through the crowd, but the press of tourists made quick movement difficult. He spoke quietly into his radio, alerting other security personnel about the situation developing near the main gate. Marcus circled around James like a predator, taking photos from different angles. "You know what would be really cool?" he said, his voice getting louder and more confident. "If you could maybe move just a little bit, give me some different poses. I know you're not supposed to talk, but a little movement wouldn't hurt, right?" When James remained perfectly still, Marcus laughed and shook his head. "Come on, man. Don't be so uptight. I'm not asking you to dance or anything. Just maybe a little nod or a smile. I'll make it worth your while. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his wallet, thick with cash and credit cards. Look, I've got money here. More than you probably make in a month. How about a little cooperation for some real compensation? The crowd's murmur grew louder. Several tourists began recording the scene with their own phones, sensing that they were witnessing something that would soon become viral on social media. A Japanese family looked on in shock, the father explaining quietly to his children in their native language that this was not how visitors should behave. James felt a slight tightness in his jaw, the only sign that Marcus's words had any effect. The suggestion that he could be bought, that his honor and duty were for sale, struck at the very core of everything he believed in. But his training held firm. He had sworn an oath, not just to his country but to himself, that he would never bring shame to the uniform he wore. Marcus mistook the silence for consideration and pressed his advantage. I'm staying at the Savoy, you know. Real luxury. Maybe, after your shift, we could grab a drink? I could tell you about some real opportunities, ways to make some serious money instead of standing around playing dress-up. The insult to his service, to years of training and sacrifice, to fallen comrades who had died defending their country, hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Other guards within earshot felt their own resolve being tested, but they too remained motionless, trusting in their training and each other. A young boy in the crowd tugged on his father's sleeve. Daddy, why is that man being mean to the soldier? The father struggled to explain, uncomfortable with having to justify such disrespectful behavior to his innocent child. Marcus, emboldened by what he perceived as victory, decided to push even further. He reached out toward James's uniform, intending to straighten an imaginary wrinkle for his photo. Let me just fix this for the shot, he said casually, as if touching a royal guard was the most natural thing in the world. This was the moment when everything changed. The casual disrespect, the attempted bribery, the mocking of military service, all of that had tested James's patience. But the moment Marcus's hand moved toward his uniform, toward the symbols of his oath and service, the situation crossed from disrespectful behavior into something far more serious. The crowd held its breath, sensing that they were about to witness something significant. Sarah Wellington covered her face with her hands, knowing that her husband had finally gone too far. The security officer pushed harder through the crowd, his urgency now apparent to everyone around him. Marcus's fingers were mere inches from the perfectly pressed red tunic, when the morning air filled with tension so thick it was almost visible. The moment of reckoning that had been building since the entitled tourist first crossed the barrier was finally at hand. The lesson and respect that Marcus so desperately needed was about to be delivered with the full weight of British military tradition behind it. The moment Marcus Wellington's fingertips brushed against the scarlet wool of James Mitchell's uniform, everything exploded into motion. James's right hand shot up with lightning speed, his white-gloved fingers clamping down on Marcus's wrist with the precision and force of a steel trap. The sudden movement was so swift and unexpected that Marcus's expensive phone flew from his other hand, clattering across the ancient stones of the courtyard. Do not touch the Queen's Guard. James's voice erupted like thunder across the palace grounds, echoing off the historic buildings with such power that birds scattered from nearby trees. The words carried the weight of centuries of military tradition, delivered with the full authority of someone who had sworn to protect the crown with his life. Marcus's face went white with shock, his mouth falling open as he stared up at the guard who suddenly seemed to tower over him like an avenging angel. The grip on his wrist was firm but controlled, exactly the amount of force needed to stop him without causing injury. For the first time in years, Marcus Wellington found himself completely powerless, held in place by someone who couldn't be bought, bullied, or impressed by his wealth. The crowd behind the barrier erupted in cheers and applause. Hundreds of tourists who had watched Marcus's disrespectful behavior with growing anger finally had their moment of satisfaction. Camera phones captured every second of the encounter, with some visitors already uploading the footage to social media with captions celebrating the guard's decisive action. "That's what I'm talking about," shouted an elderly British veteran, his voice filled with pride for the young soldier. "Show that disrespectful fool what discipline looks like." Sarah Wellington stood frozen behind the barrier, her hand covering her mouth as she watched her husband receive the comeuppance she had secretly hoped for, but never thought would actually happen. Part of her felt embarrassed by the public spectacle, but a larger part felt relief that someone had finally stood up to Marcus's entitled behavior. Palace security officers converged on the scene from multiple directions, their black uniforms cutting through the crowd with practiced efficiency. The lead officer, a stern-faced man named Sergeant Thompson with 20 years of experience, approached the situation with calm professionalism. James maintained his grip on Marcus's wrist while keeping his eyes focused straight ahead, his training taking over completely. "Sir, you have violated palace security protocols by crossing established barriers and making unauthorized physical contact with a member of the Queen's Guard. You will remain still while security personnel address this incident." Marcus tried to pull his arm free, but James's grip remained steady and unmovable. "Let go of me," Marcus sputtered, his usual confidence replaced by panic and indignation. "Do you know who I am? I'll have your job for this. I'll sue this whole damn country." The threats that had worked so well for Marcus in business meetings and exclusive restaurants fell flat against James's unwavering composure. Money meant nothing to a man who had volunteered to put his life on the line for his country. Lawsuits couldn't intimidate someone who had faced enemy combatants in active war zones. Sergeant Thompson reached the scene and immediately assessed the situation with professional eyes. He could see the tourists' expensive clothes, the scattered phone, and the respectful distance maintained by other visitors. Most importantly, he could see the calm, controlled demeanor of Guard Mitchell, whose actions had clearly been measured and appropriate. "Sir, I'm Sergeant Thompson with Palace Security," he announced to Marcus in a voice that brooked no argument. "You are currently in violation of multiple security protocols. I need you to remain calm and cooperate fully with our procedures." Marcus's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. The crowd of tourists was still watching, many of them recording the encounter, and he could hear the whispered comments and occasional bursts of laughter. His carefully cultivated image as a successful, sophisticated traveler was crumbling before hundreds of witnesses. "This is ridiculous," Marcus shouted, his voice cracking slightly. "I'm an American citizen. I demand to speak to the American embassy. You can't treat me like this," a middle-aged woman in the crowd called out. "You should have thought of that before you disrespected our soldiers." Her comment was met with more applause and agreement from the surrounding tourists. James finally released Marcus's wrist but remained at attention, his presence still commanding and authoritative. The brief physical intervention had been perfectly executed, enough to stop the inappropriate behavior without escalating to unnecessary force. His years of military training had taught him exactly how to handle situations like this with precision and restraint. Sergeant Thompson stepped between Marcus and the guard, creating a buffer while additional security personnel established a wider perimeter. "Sir, you crossed security barriers, attempted to touch a member of the Queen's Guard, and disrupted an official ceremony. These are serious breaches of palace security." Marcus rubbed his wrist, though James's grip had left no mark or injury. The physical reminder of his powerlessness stung more than any actual pain. "I want to file a complaint," he demanded. "That soldier assaulted me. I barely touched his uniform." "Sir," Sergeant Thompson replied with practiced patience, "our security cameras recorded the entire incident. They clearly show you crossing barriers, approaching the guard despite verbal warnings from other visitors, and initiating physical contact." Guard Mitchell's response was entirely appropriate and within protocol. The mention of security cameras made Marcus's stomach drop. He suddenly realized that his behavior had been documented from multiple angles, both by official palace security and by dozens of tourist phones. The evidence against him was overwhelming and undeniable. A young girl in the crowd pointed toward Marcus and asked her mother loudly, "Why was that man trying to bother the nice soldier?" The innocent question, heard clearly by everyone nearby, perfectly captured the absurdity of Marcus's behavior from a child's perspective. James remained at his post, having returned to his previous stance of perfect stillness and composure. To look at him now, no one would know that moments before he had delivered one of the most decisive and justified corrections ever witnessed at Buckingham Palace. His breathing was steady, his expression neutral, his bearing proud and dignified. The morning sun continued to shine down on the scene, but the atmosphere had completely transformed. What had started as Marcus's moment of entitled triumph had become his moment of absolute humiliation. The lesson in respect he so desperately needed was being delivered with surgical precision by professionals who understood the true meaning of honor and duty. Within minutes of the confrontation, additional palace security personnel arrived to escort Marcus Wellington away from the guard post. 2 officers flanked him while Sergeant Thompson led the way toward a discreet security office located within the palace complex. Marcus's face burned with humiliation as hundreds of tourists watched his march of shame, many still recording with their phones and commenting loudly about his behavior. "This is a mistake," Marcus insisted as they walked, his voice strained and desperate. "I'm a successful businessman. I've never been in trouble with the law. This is all just a misunderstanding, Sergeant." Thompson didn't respond as he guided the group through a side entrance marked, "Authorized personnel only." The contrast between the public grandeur of the palace exterior and the practical, no-nonsense security areas inside was stark. Plain corridors with security monitors and communication equipment replaced the ornate decorations tourists typically associated with royal residences. Meanwhile, back at the guard post, James Mitchell had seamlessly returned to his duties as if nothing had happened. His fellow guards maintained their positions with the same unwavering discipline, but there was a subtle sense of pride and solidarity among them. James had handled the situation exactly as their training demanded, with appropriate force, perfect timing, and complete professionalism. The crowd of tourists gradually began to disperse. Though many lingered to discuss what they had witnessed, stories were already being shared on social media, with hashtags like #NoRespectTheGuards and #EntitledTourist trending across various platforms. Videos of the encounter were being viewed thousands of times within the first hour, with overwhelmingly positive comments supporting the guards' actions. A British military veteran approached the barrier and saluted James quietly, a gesture of respect from one serviceman to another. "Well done, son," he whispered, just loud enough for James to hear without breaking protocol. The old soldier understood the discipline required to handle such situations with restraint and precision. In the security office, Marcus was seated at a plain metal table while Sergeant Thompson reviewed his identification documents. The expensive passport, exclusive credit cards, and business cards that usually impressed people seemed insignificant in this sterile, official environment. "Mr. Wellington," Sergeant Thompson began, his tone professional but firm, "we need to discuss the serious nature of your actions this morning. Buckingham Palace is not just a tourist attraction, it's a working royal residence and a symbol of our nation's history and values." Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his usual confidence completely shattered. "Look, I understand I may have gotten a little close, but I didn't mean any harm. I was just trying to get some good photos for my social media." "Isn't that what tourists do?" "What tourists do," Sergeant Thompson replied evenly, "is respect the barriers, follow the rules, and show appropriate reverence for our traditions and the people who protect them. They don't cross security lines, attempt to bribe our guards, or treat our servicemen like props in their personal entertainment." The weight of his actions was beginning to sink in for Marcus. In the business world, he was accustomed to finding ways around inconvenient rules, to using his wealth and connections to smooth over problems. But here, facing the representatives of an institution that had endured for over 1,000 years, his usual tactics were not just ineffective, they were deeply offensive. "The guard who stopped you," Sergeant Thompson continued, "is a decorated veteran who served multiple tours in Afghanistan. He's risked his life for his country, and now serves with honor in one of our most prestigious military positions. Your suggestion that he could be bought with your money was not just inappropriate, it was insulting to everything he represents." Marcus's throat felt dry as the full scope of his disrespect became clear. He had been so focused on his own desires, his own image, that he had failed to see the human being behind the uniform. The guard wasn't a tourist attraction or a photo opportunity. He was a real person with real service, real sacrifice, and real dignity. Back outside, Sarah Wellington remained near the palace gates, unsure whether to wait for her husband or simply return to their hotel. She felt a complex mixture of emotions: embarrassment at Marcus's behavior, relief that someone had finally held him accountable, and worry about what consequences might follow. A kind British woman noticed Sarah's distress and approached her gently. "Are you all right, dear? That was your husband, wasn't it?" When Sarah nodded, the woman continued, "I hope you don't mind me saying, but that guard showed remarkable restraint. Your husband needed to learn that lesson." Sarah found herself nodding in agreement. "He's always been like this," she admitted quietly. "He thinks money can buy respect, that rules don't apply to him. I've been hoping something would happen to make him understand, but I never thought it would be so public." Inside the security office, Sergeant Thompson was explaining the potential consequences of Marcus's actions. Interfering with royal security, crossing established barriers, and making physical contact with a guard on duty are all serious offenses. While we understand this may have been a case of cultural misunderstanding rather than malicious intent, there are protocols that must be followed. Marcus felt panic rising in his chest. What kind of consequences are we talking about? I can't have this on my record. I have business dealings, reputation to consider. Surely we can work something out. "Mr. Wellington," Sergeant Thompson said with a slight shake of his head, "this is exactly the attitude that got you into this situation. You cannot buy or negotiate your way out of showing proper respect. What you can do is demonstrate that you understand the gravity of your actions and commit to behaving appropriately going forward." The security office felt smaller and more oppressive as Marcus contemplated his situation. Outside these walls, videos of his humiliation were spreading across the internet. His expensive vacation had turned into a nightmare of public embarrassment and potential legal consequences. For the first time in years, Marcus Wellington found himself truly powerless, facing people who could not be impressed, bought, or intimidated. The lesson in respect he had so desperately needed was being delivered systematically and thoroughly. Every aspect of his entitled worldview was being challenged by professionals who understood the difference between earned respect and demanded deference. The morning that had started with such promise for Marcus had become a masterclass in the consequences of arrogance and the power of genuine dignity. As the hours passed in the security office, Marcus Wellington's world continued to crumble around him. Sergeant Thompson had stepped out to coordinate with other officials, leaving Marcus alone with his thoughts for the first time since the incident. The silence was deafening, broken only by the quiet hum of security monitors and the distant sounds of normal palace operations. His expensive watch showed that nearly 3 hours had passed since his confrontation with the guard, 3 hours during which his behavior had been analyzed, documented, and reviewed by multiple levels of palace security and metropolitan police. The gravity of his situation was becoming impossible to ignore. Marcus pulled out his backup phone and discovered that his humiliation had already gone viral. Videos of the incident had been shared thousands of times across social media platforms, with news outlets picking up the story. Headlines read, "Entitled American Tourist Gets Reality Check from Royal Guard," and "When Privilege Meets Protocol. Tourist's Epic Fail at Buckingham Palace." The comments on the videos were overwhelmingly critical of his behavior. People from around the world were praising the guard's professionalism and condemning Marcus's disrespectful conduct. His business associates would see this coverage. His clients would recognize him. The professional reputation he had spent decades building was being destroyed by a few minutes of entitled behavior. Meanwhile, back at the guard post, the changing of the guard ceremony had continued with its usual precision and dignity. James Mitchell had completed his shift without any further incidents, but word of his perfect handling of the tourist situation had spread throughout the military community. His commanding officers had reviewed the security footage and were impressed by his restraint, timing, and adherence to protocol. In the guards' quarters, James was changing out of his ceremonial uniform when his sergeant approached him. "Outstanding work this morning, Mitchell. That was a textbook example of how to handle an inappropriate civilian contact. The tourist learned his lesson without anyone getting hurt, and you maintained the dignity of the guard throughout." James nodded respectfully. "Thank you, Sergeant." The man just needed to understand that some things aren't for sale and some boundaries aren't meant to be crossed. The sergeant smiled. "Indeed. And from what I hear, that lesson was delivered quite effectively. The footage is already being used in training discussions about proper civilian management during ceremonial duties." Back in the security office, Sergeant Thompson returned with additional paperwork and a more serious expression. "Mr. Wellington, I've been in consultation with the Metropolitan Police and Palace legal advisors. Given the public nature of this incident and the security implications, We need to discuss your options moving forward. Marcus felt his stomach clench. What kind of options? You have 3 paths available to you, Sergeant Thompson explained methodically. First, we can process this through the criminal justice system, which would involve formal charges, court appearances, and a permanent criminal record. Second, we can treat this as a civil matter with significant financial penalties and travel restrictions. Or third, you can accept a comprehensive educational intervention along with community service requirements. The mention of criminal charges made Marcus's hands tremble slightly. A criminal record would devastate his business dealings and potentially affect his ability to travel internationally. What would the educational intervention involve? He asked quietly. Sergeant Thompson consulted his notes. You would spend a full day with various military and cultural education specialists, learning about British traditions, military service, and appropriate tourist behavior. You would also complete 100 hours of community service, specifically working with veteran support organizations. Additionally, you would write formal apologies to Guard Mitchell and the palace administration. Marcus's pride rebelled against the idea of apologizing and doing community service like a common criminal, but his practical mind recognized it as the least damaging option. And if I agreed to this program, there would be no criminal charges? Correct, provided you complete all requirements satisfactorily and demonstrate genuine understanding of why your behavior was inappropriate. However, any future incidents of this nature would result in immediate criminal prosecution with enhanced penalties. The weight of having to humble himself before the very people he had insulted was almost unbearable for Marcus, but the alternative consequences were even worse. His business empire, his social standing, his entire carefully constructed identity depended on avoiding a criminal record. Outside the palace, Sarah Wellington had returned to their hotel and spent the afternoon fielding phone calls from friends and business associates who had seen the viral videos. Each conversation was more humiliating than the last, as she tried to explain her husband's behavior to people who had always seen Marcus as successful and sophisticated. Sarah, we just saw the video online, said Margaret, one of their country club friends. Is Marcus all right? He seemed completely out of control. People are saying he tried to bribe a soldier and got physically restrained. Sarah found herself unable to defend her husband's actions. He's been under a lot of stress lately with business, but that's no excuse for what happened. I'm honestly ashamed of how he behaved. The conversation continued with Margaret expressing concern and offering support, but Sarah could hear the underlying judgment in her friend's voice. Their social circle was built on maintaining appearances and proper behavior. Marcus's public humiliation would follow them for years. Back in the security office, Marcus was reviewing the educational intervention paperwork when Sergeant Thompson made an unexpected offer. Mr. Wellington, before you make your final decision, there's someone who would like to speak with you. Guard Mitchell has volunteered to meet with you privately if you're willing. Marcus looked up in surprise. The guard wants to talk to me. Why? That's between you and him, sir. But I can tell you that it's not required for any of the resolution options. He's offering this meeting of his own accord. The idea of facing the man he had tried to humiliate, the soldier whose dignity and honor he had attacked, filled Marcus with dread. But something in Sergeant Thompson's tone suggested this might be an opportunity, rather than additional punishment. Yes, Marcus said quietly. I'll meet with him. As arrangements were made for the meeting, Marcus realized that his day of reckoning was far from over. The encounter with Guard Mitchell would likely be the most difficult conversation of his life, but perhaps it was exactly the conversation he needed to have. The lesson in respect that had begun with his public humiliation was about to become deeply personal. The meeting room was small and plain, with just a table and 2 chairs facing each other. Marcus Wellington sat nervously, adjusting his tie and trying to prepare himself for what might be the most uncomfortable conversation of his life. When the door opened and James Mitchell entered, still wearing his dress uniform but without the ceremonial bearskin hat, Marcus was struck by how young the guard looked and how tired his eyes seemed. James sat down across from Marcus with the same composed dignity he had displayed during the morning's incident. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of everything that had happened and everything that needed to be said. Thank you for agreeing to meet with me, James said finally, his voice calm and professional. I wanted to speak with you because I don't think you understood what happened this morning. and I believe everyone deserves a chance to learn from their mistakes. Marcus expected anger, lectures, or condescension, but James's tone was surprisingly thoughtful and measured. I owe you an apology, Marcus began awkwardly. My behavior was inappropriate. I realize that now. James nodded slightly. Tell me about your life, Mr. Wellington. What do you do for work? What's important to you? The unexpected question caught Marcus off guard. I run a consulting business, strategic planning for corporations. I've built it from nothing into a multi-million-dollar company. It's taken me 20 years of constant work, sacrifice, and dedication, and you're proud of that achievement, James observed. You should be. Building something meaningful from nothing requires real commitment and skill. Marcus felt confused by the guard's reasonable tone. Yes, I am proud, but I don't understand why you're asking about my work. James leaned forward slightly. Because I want you to imagine how you would feel if someone walked into your office, mocked your achievements, suggested your work was just playing dress-up, and then offered to pay you to abandon your professional standards. The parallel hit Marcus like a physical blow. For the first time, he began to see the morning's events from James's perspective. Your work. Being a guard? It's not just a job, is it? No, Mr. Wellington, it's not just a job. I spent 4 years in the military, including 2 tours in Afghanistan. I watched friends die protecting our country and our values. I came home and competed with hundreds of other soldiers for the honor of serving in the Queen's Guard. This uniform represents every sacrifice I've made and every principle I believe in. Marcus felt his throat tighten as the full weight of his insults became clear. I called it playing dress-up. I said you were just a regular guy in a costume. You also suggested I could be bought, James continued, his voice remaining steady despite the pain the memory clearly caused. You offered me money to abandon my post, to treat my oath and my service as something for sale. Do you understand what that meant to me? The room seemed to shrink around Marcus as shame washed over him in waves. I'm so sorry, he whispered. I never thought. I only saw what I wanted to see. I didn't see you as a real person with real feelings and real honor. James studied Marcus carefully, looking for signs of genuine remorse rather than calculated responses. What made you think you could behave that way? I'm curious about how someone reaches the point where they believe rules don't apply to them. Marcus struggled to answer honestly. Success, I suppose. When you have money, people usually let you get away with things. Hotels give you better rooms. Restaurants seat you faster. Problems tend to disappear when you can pay for solutions. I started believing that everything had a price and everyone could be influenced. But that's not really living, is it? James asked gently. If people only treat you well because of your money, if respect only comes through payment, then what you have isn't respect at all. It's just a transaction. The observation cut deeper than Marcus expected. I've never thought about it that way. James leaned back in his chair. Real respect is earned through character, through how you treat others, through the principles you uphold even when it's difficult. Money can buy compliance and politeness, but it can't buy genuine respect or honor. Marcus found himself really listening to someone else's perspective for the first time in years. How do you do it? Stand there while people like me behave so badly? How do you maintain your composure? Training helps, James admitted. But mostly it's about remembering what I'm protecting and why it matters. I'm not just standing guard over a building or following orders. I'm preserving traditions that connect us to our history, maintaining standards that mean something, representing values that are bigger than any individual person, including entitled tourists who don't understand those values, Marcus said with bitter self-awareness. Especially then, James confirmed. Anyone can maintain standards when it's easy. The real test comes when someone challenges you, when maintaining your principles costs you something or requires you to endure discomfort. Marcus sat quietly, processing everything James had shared. The young soldier had shown him more grace and wisdom than he deserved, taking time to educate rather than simply condemn. Why are you doing this? Why are you trying to help me understand instead of just letting me face the consequences? James considered the question carefully. Because I believe people can change, and because what happened this morning says more about what's missing in your life than what's wrong with your character. You're not a bad person, Mr. Wellington. You're someone who lost sight of what really matters. The conversation continued for another hour, with James sharing stories about his military service, his family's tradition of public service, and the deep satisfaction that came from being part of something greater than himself. Marcus found himself opening up about his own life, admitting to the loneliness that came with relationships based on wealth rather than genuine connection. As their meeting drew to a close, Marcus realized that this conversation had been more valuable than any business deal he had ever negotiated. He had learned more about respect, honor, and genuine strength in 2 hours than he had in decades of pursuing financial success. "Thank you," Marcus said as they prepared to leave, "for stopping me this morning when I was behaving so poorly, and for taking the time to help me understand why it mattered. I don't know if I can change completely, but I want to try." James stood and extended his hand. "Change is possible, Mr. Wellington, but it has to come from a genuine desire to be better, not just from wanting to avoid consequences." As they shook hands, Marcus felt something shift inside him. The lesson in respect he had been receiving all day was finally taking root, planted by the unexpected kindness and wisdom of the man he had tried to humiliate. 6 months later, Marcus Wellington stood in the volunteer coordinator's office at the London Veterans Support Center, completing his final community service hours. The man who had once tried to bribe a Royal Guard now spent his Saturdays helping former soldiers navigate job placement programs and housing applications. The transformation had been gradual but profound, shaped by countless hours of listening to stories of real sacrifice and genuine service. "Marcus, could you help Mr. Thompson with his benefits paperwork?" asked Janet, the center coordinator. "He's been struggling with the forms for weeks." Marcus nodded and approached the elderly veteran who was hunched over a stack of confusing government documents. 6 months ago, Marcus would have dismissed such a person as beneath his notice. Now he saw a man who had served his country with honor and deserved support in his time of need. "Let me take a look at these with you," Marcus said gently, pulling up a chair beside the veteran. "Government paperwork can be a nightmare, but we'll figure it out together." As they worked through the forms, Marcus reflected on how dramatically his life had changed since that humiliating morning at Buckingham Palace. The viral videos of his encounter with James Mitchell had cost him several major clients initially, forcing him to rebuild his business reputation from the ground up. But the new relationships he had formed were based on genuine respect, rather than fear or financial dependency. The educational intervention program had been more challenging than any business deal he had ever negotiated. Military historians had taught him about the centuries of tradition behind the ceremonies he had mocked. Psychologists had helped him understand how his wealth had isolated him from meaningful human connections. Most importantly, veterans had shared their stories of service, sacrifice, and the deep bonds formed through shared commitment to something greater than themselves. Sarah Wellington had been amazed by the changes in her husband. The arrogant, entitled man she had married was slowly being replaced by someone who listened more than he spoke, who asked questions about others rather than constantly promoting himself. Their relationship, strained for years by Marcus's behavior, was finally beginning to heal. "You know," Sarah had said to him just the week before, "I think that guard did us both a favor. I was starting to forget why I fell in love with you in the first place. But the man you're becoming reminds me of who you used to be before success changed you." At the Veterans Center, Marcus finished helping Mr. Thompson with his paperwork and moved on to his next task. He was organizing donated clothes for job interviews, ensuring that veterans had appropriate attire for meeting with potential employers. The work was humble and unglamorous, but Marcus had discovered a satisfaction in practical service that his previous life of luxury had never provided. James Mitchell, meanwhile, had continued his duties with the Queen's Guard, while also becoming something of an inspiration to his fellow servicemen. The video of his professional handling of the entitled tourist had been shown in military training programs as an example of proper restraint and composure under pressure. But James took more pride in the letter he had received from Marcus 3 months after their meeting. The letter had been carefully handwritten, expressing genuine gratitude for James's patience and wisdom. Marcus had described his volunteer work and the changes he was making in his business practices. Most importantly, he had acknowledged that James's lesson in respect had given him something far more valuable than any business success, the understanding of what it meant to live with genuine honor and purpose. And Marcus prepared to leave the Veterans Center at the end of his community service commitment. Janet approached him with an unexpected request. Marcus, I know you've completed your required hours, but I was wondering if you might consider staying on as a regular volunteer. Your business experience has been incredibly helpful for our job placement program. Marcus felt a warmth spread through his chest. 6 months ago, the idea of continuing volunteer work beyond what was required would have been absurd to him, but the work had become one of the most meaningful parts of his week. I'd be honored to continue helping, he replied. This work matters more than most people realize. That evening, Marcus returned to his hotel, a modest but comfortable place rather than the luxury suite he would have chosen before. He had dinner with Sarah at a small local restaurant, talking about the veterans he had helped that day and the progress they were making in rebuilding their lives. I want to go back to Buckingham Palace tomorrow, Marcus said suddenly. Not as a tourist this time, but to pay my respects properly, Sarah smiled. I think that's a wonderful idea. The next morning, Marcus and Sarah joined the crowd gathered for the changing of the guard ceremony. This time, Marcus stood respectfully behind the barriers, watching the precision and dignity of the guards with genuine appreciation rather than mockery. He scanned the faces of the guards, hoping to catch a glimpse of James Mitchell, but recognizing that the young soldier might have been transferred to other duties. When the ceremony concluded, Marcus approached the barrier where tourists often ask questions of the guards. A young corporal stood nearby, and Marcus addressed him with quiet respect. Excuse me, Corporal. I wanted to ask if it would be appropriate for me to leave a letter for one of your colleagues, Guard Mitchell. He helped teach me an important lesson about respect several months ago, and I wanted to thank him again. The corporal studied Marcus for a moment, perhaps recognizing him from the infamous video that had circulated through military channels. I'll see that Guard Mitchell receives your letter, sir. Marcus handed over a carefully written note expressing his continued gratitude and describing how the lesson in respect had changed his life. As he walked away from the palace, he felt a sense of closure and peace that had eluded him for years. The entitled tourist who had crossed the line with a royal guard no longer existed. In his place stood a man who understood that true respect could only be earned through character, service, and genuine care for others. The instant regret he had felt that morning had grown into lasting change, proving that even the most humbling experiences could become opportunities for growth and redemption. Marcus Wellington had learned that respect wasn't something money could buy, position could demand, or arrogance could claim. It was something that had to be earned through daily choices to honor others, serve something greater than oneself, and maintain dignity even in difficult circumstances. The Royal Guard had given him far more than a lesson in proper tourist behavior. He had given him a roadmap to becoming a better human being.